I have had
Enough of apple picking. I am overtired by the great harvest I myself desired. By Robert Frost. My name is Upasana and today I'm here to give a presentation on the topic after apple picking. First of all, I'm a second year student of BA English Honours batch 2019 to 22. Poem into three main parts: summary of the poem, themes of the poem, analysis of the poem. So without any further, let's start our topic.
After Apple Picking is one of those early poems by Robert Frost that makes people think of him as a unique New England poet. After Apple Picking was published in Frost's second collection, North of Boston, in 1915. His first collection was titled as A Boy's Will. It is one of his best works, with such classics as Mending Wall, Home Burial, and Death of the Hired Man. The collection gave him his first taste of fame. Now, what is After Apple Picking about, and why should I care? People often have their most interesting thoughts just before they go to sleep. Don't you ever wish you put those thoughts into words? This poem demonstrates just how much you can understand about a person from the vague, drifting thoughts that occur just before passing into the land of Nod. The speaker of After Apple Picking keeps close track of the progress of his thoughts before sleep. The speaker discovers just how much his own everyday experience is structured by stories written thousands of years ago in biblical times. Thoughts about falling eyes and falling apples leads to suggestions of lost innocence and worldly corruption. In the same way, you probably have fears, desires, and concerns that influence in subtle ways that you might not even recognize. Self knowledge is always a good thing, and great poets like Robert Frost can help illuminate the hidden meanings beneath your most random run of mill thoughts. Now, let's see what is in the summary of After Apple Picking. A guy has been picking apples all day up on a ladder. He hasn't picked every last apple, but night is coming and he is tired. He remembers the strange vision he had that morning when he looked at a bunch of grass through a sheet of ice he removed from drinking straw. It looked like the world was melting, and then he dropped the piece of ice. He may or may not be falling asleep as he has these thoughts. He thinks of how he will dream about apples. He is sick of harvesting apples. There are so many of them, and he has to be careful not to let them fall. If an apple falls, it has to be chucked into the heap to use for making cider. Those cider apples are considered almost worthless. He is responsible to pick each of the apple without letting them fall because it was his job. He imagines that these thoughts about worthless apples and dropping things will haunt his sleep. He wonders if it will be a long deep sleep like the hibernation of a woodchuck, or whether it will be just a normal human sleep. Now let us talk about the analysis of this poem. First one is sound check. The poem's sound is like an early 20th century version of freestyle rap. Ever heard of freestyle about apples before? Us neither. That's why Frost is an American original. After Apple Picking has an improvisational feel, and Frost doesn't worry about maintaining a regular rhythm or rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme is the best example of how Frost is motivated by sound and not by form. He's like a rapper or a slam poet in the way that he sticks with a rhyme until he runs out the good uses for it. In lines 14 to 16, he rhymes well, fell, and tell within a short space. Now let us talk about the setting of the poem. Night time. A man lies snugly in bed. As for the geographic setting, we are of course north of Boston, the title of the collection in which after apple picking appears. The speaker's thoughts are flooded with sunlight and apples, apples, apples. There are apples flying across his vision. The poem jumps from moment to moment. Now it is morning and frost hangs on the grass. Now it is late afternoon and the last empty barrel stands next to a ladder. The farm is busy with industry. There are some scattered images of falling items. First, an ice sheet falls, but our vision cuts away before it can break, as if this would be somehow traumatic. Then, in slow mo, a falling apple, no, image of a man desperately leaping with outstretched hand to catch it. Too late, throw that one in reject pile. After all this mental wandering, we are back to the speaker, who finally falls asleep. He was hoping that the woodchuck would come by to diagnose his sleep, but no such luck. In our mental vision of the poem, the scene ends with the woodchuck suddenly appearing after he has fallen asleep to do a little dance like the gopher from Caddyshack, but that probably didn't really happen. Wordplay, symbols, imagery. The Bible is never explicitly mentioned in this poem, but first nonetheless includes several references to well-known stories from the book of Genesis. The story of Jacob's ladder and fall of Adam and Eve both seem on the speaker's mind. Line 1 and 2. The image of a ladder pointing toward heaven alludes to the story of Jacob's ladder in the book of Genesis. When Jacob was escaping from his jealous brother Esau, he dreamed of a ladder going up to the heaven and had angels climbing it. God was at the top of the ladder, and he told Jacob that Jacob and his descendants would be blessed. Line 13. The speaker is thinking about the items falling because he has been trying not to drop apples all day, but the combination of falling and fruit seems to allude to the biblical fall, in which Adam and Eve tasted the forbidden fruit and were therefore expelled from the Garden of Eden. Lines 21 and 22. At this point, we know that he is beginning to dream, which makes the connection to the story of Jacob's ladder even more clear. Lines 31 to 36. The apples that fell and hit the earth are symbols of thin and earthly corruption. They are treated as of no worth, similar to how Adam and Eve were treated after they metaphorically fell to earth by tasting the forbidden fruit. Nature as both magnificent and troubling. Frost is often wrongly assumed to be a simple nature poet who celebrates the joy of the outside world through rose-colored glasses. But generally, the people who think this have not read enough of his poems, because even in his most nostalgic nature poems like this one, there is an underlying darkness. And after apple picking, he worries about the way apple falls, and those are perceived as worthless, and says his dreams will be troubled. For an illustration of this trend in Frost's work, check out his poems like Fire and Ice, Acquainted with the Night. Now let's move forward to the themes of the poem. First one is versions of reality. You might call After Apple Picking a realist poem in the same way that you would talk about a realist short story or novel. The poem depicts real life activities in naturalistic detail, without any direct reference to fantasy or the supernatural, and yet The setting shifts back and forth from place to place without warning, as in a dream. And Frost touches on religious and supernatural subjects in subtle ways, using apples and ladders and falling things. From reading this poem, you do not know from what perspective it is being narrated. Maybe the whole thing is a dream, maybe none of it is. What is your interpretation? I hope you guys must have interpreted the last thing. Now let's move forward. Tradition and customs. Frost takes an activity, apple picking, that most would consider either good clean fun or hard manual labor, and gives it an unfamiliar and also slightly disconcerting edge. Apple picking is done every year at orchards, and it signals the end of the harvesting season and the beginning of winter. It is a long process that cannot be done in a day or two at a large orchard. But this poem follows the poet Ezra Pound's famous advice, make it new. This perspective of tradition and customs is analogous to the perspective of the speaker of the poem when he looks through the sheet of ice. The disorientation of the experience stays with you long afterwards. Let's talk about the next theme, that is dissatisfaction. The speaker has that feeling of too much of a good thing. He has probably been waiting for the apple harvest all summer, but now there are just so many apples to deal with that he has grown sick and tired of picking them. He is worn out, but we can't quite tell whether it is that happy tired feeling. He feels like he could almost sleep for an entire winter, which sounds great to us. But he is also worried that his sleep will be haunted by his dreams about apples and dropping things, and worst of all, cider. Maybe dissatisfaction isn't the most accurate word here. Unsettled might be the closer to the mark. Next theme is sin. The biggest sin in this poem is dropping an apple. But the wider concept of sin, corruption, and the fall of man from the book of Genesis seems to be hinted as strongly in the language and images. The speaker feels bad for the apples that have touched the ground and are consequently smashed up to make juice instead. This attitude suggests that he might feel bad for the human race as a whole, which often aims for lofty spiritual goals only to get bruised or worse by earthly flaws. Last but not the least of the themes is memory and the past. What is past and what is present in this poem? Is after apple picking narrated from within the orchard or later at that night? Did he really look through a sheet of ice that morning, or did his mind produce this memory on its own? In this poem, Frost is not concerned with the facts of the past so much as the imagination's ability to apple pick, the ideas and the images that are most resonant, then weave them into strange, confusing quilts of memory. Also, memory is not just a mental phenomenon. His body contains its own no less essential memories of standing on the ladder and cautiously collecting apples for days to end. That is all for my presentation for today. I hope you got to know something about the poem.